Greetings and welcome to the Dr. J Vlog series. It is Friday, March 28th, 2025, and on Fridays we look into human behavior and justifications. So today's vlog is going to be looking at Trump's electoral success. Some of you may recall on Monday during my mathematics and statistics segment, I painted a statistical portrait of President Trump's electoral victory from a vote standpoint and some of the underlying demographic trends and so forth. Today, I'm going to be looking into trying to do a deeper dive in explaining how President Trump was successful in capturing the 47th and becoming the 47th president of the United States. So where I'd like to start is with the pandemic. So in the aftermath specifically of COVID-19, inflation took off all over the world after governments had been putting huge amounts of money into their citizenry's hands during the lockdown. The money obviously was meant to help a great many people cope, especially after losing their jobs or being forced to shelter in place or reduced work schedules. And obviously, many people weren't able to earn their normal salaries, among other problems. But all of the government borrowing really spurred on inflation. And as we emerged from the pandemic, we saw inflation accelerate in 2021 and then most dramatically in 2022. And it still remained higher than expected or than hoped for in 2023. Now, by 2024, which was the year of electoral politics in the United States, inflation was back under control and back to sort of normal or expected levels. But the damage had already been done in some respects. The incumbent governments all over the world lost power or lost seats in their parliaments. So that's not just an isolated phenomenon in the U.S. It doesn't matter either that most of the economic indicators in 2024 were actually pointing in the right direction, or that the U.S. had quite a healthy economy in terms of inflation, job growth, increases in manufacturing jobs, lower unemployment, etc. Again, the damage was already done. And the right wing, and Trump in particular, just echoed basically the same phrase over and over again, that Biden and his administration had left the U.S. in a mess. And by the same token, that we're going to fix this mess, and we're going to fix it on day one. Now, of course, that wasn't objectively true by any reasonable standards, but that's not the point. Millions of people genuinely had suffered during the pandemic. And again, I don't just mean obviously the people who'd lost their lives and their families, but many people were and still are hurting from an economic standpoint too. And even though inflation was back to normal, that doesn't mean that the prices came back to what they were during the pandemic or prior to the pandemic. They hadn't. And they still haven't. And I don't think they will. So average people everywhere are still seeing higher prices and higher chunks of their paychecks being spent on the basic necessities and housing costs. But it's part of a much broader and longer-term trend than either Trump or Biden. Of course, either can and did try to exploit those trends, and then, of course, after Biden dropped out, Harris did the same. But my point is that people in general have far less purchasing power, especially in the United States, in real terms compared to what they had, say, in 1970. For example, Gen Z dollars today have about 86% less purchasing power than that of the baby boomers back when they were in their early 20s. Perhaps and most powerfully of all, as of 2022, the National Consumer Price Index, CPI, had increased by over 500% since 1970, but wages had increased only about 80%. And in today's dollars, Gen Zers and millennials are paying nearly 100% more on average, for their homes compared with what the baby boomers were paying in the early 1970s. Beyond that, we've seen tuition and education costs go up steadily and in relative terms compared to where they were back in 1970. And all of this is to suggest that it's really not Biden or Harris then or Trump's fault, at least heading into the 2024 election. You can make whatever case you like to fit your political agenda, but I think Trump was especially able to harness that economic fear, concerns, and insecurity more effectively, and certainly at least enough to get more votes in the end. Now, that said, there are certainly many indicators now that would suggest things might be getting worse, at least in the short term. Even many of those who voted for Trump are having a kind of buyer's remorse, but that's irrelevant. As are your concerns, perhaps, about oligarchy or the benefits of the billionaire and the corporate class and so on. Because what you might have been thinking if you voted for Trump heading into the election was that, hey, at least we'll be better off under Trump than we were under Biden. And you could have thought, hey, it's fine if the rich get richer, more power to them. But as long as I'm doing better too. And then when you looked at the candidates, specifically Trump versus Harris, obviously more people said, you know what, I think I'll do better under Trump than under Harris. And so it becomes easy then to align your beliefs and justify your support of your preferred candidate thusly. A Democrat, for example, might simply say, hey, look at all the positive indicators under Biden, and look how he handled the pandemic, and look at everything that's happened. And so, as a result, I think I'm gonna vote for Harris. But someone else might say, hey, wait a minute, I'm not doing that great, or I didn't do that great under Biden and since the pandemic, and Trump's promising to build back America better than ever before, promising to cut taxes, cut waste and fraud, and deregulate the economy and create jobs. So that sounds great. I think I'll do better under the Republicans. So why not vote for Trump? And that includes, by the way, a certain chunk of non-white males, Hispanic and black males, a slight number, but nonetheless, some of whom decided, you know what, or were probably hoping, hey, even if they didn't necessarily like Trump or all of his rhetoric, maybe they trusted the overall messaging and that they'd be better off too. So that's on the more purely economic side. But then there's also the culture war issues. And these are quite numerous. And just in general, that broad sense then that people's identities and communities were and are being threatened by the change that's going on all around them. Again, this isn't the fight of Biden or then Harris and Trump. They weren't the ones that created these issues. Instead, they reflect much longer-term trends, arguably dating back to the 1960s with the Civil Rights Movement, and then the subsequent liberation movements of the 60s and 70s, not just civil rights, but women's rights, gay rights, etc. No matter what your politics or perspective, there has been and continues to be a great demographic transformation that's been happening worldwide, but especially in places like Canada and the US. On the one hand, people have been having fewer and fewer babies, and that trend has been especially pronounced amongst the dominant group in the US of white women. They have a total fertility rate as of 2023 of 1.57, which is well below the demographic standard of 2.1 to ensure adequate replacement. A total fertility rate, TFR, of 2.1 children per woman means that, on average, that's the number that's needed to sustain a population's size over time, assuming no net migration or unchanged mortality. So the fertility rates then are below replacement levels. not only for white women born in the U.S., but also, for that matter, for African American and Hispanic women born in the U.S. as well. But nonetheless, their fertility rates are still higher than that of white women. And so if nothing else changed, the population would gradually, over time, shift more in the direction of a relative proportion, or a higher proportion of women of color, or people of color. And then you have to add on to that, or factor in, the importance of migration and immigration. And guess what? We see an even more dramatic trend, especially in the US and in Canada for that matter. So more people of color or non-European origins are entering the US than ever before. Immigrants now make up about 15% of the US population in total, compared to only about 5% in 1970. And where are the immigrants coming from these days? Well, in 2023, the number one country by far was Mexico, followed by Cuba, and in third, India, the Dominican Republic, and then China in fifth. Then the Philippines, Vietnam, Afghanistan, Brazil, El Salvador, Colombia, and so on. In fact, none of the top 20 countries in terms of immigration in 2023 are predominantly white countries as such, or European. In fact, after Nepal in 20th place, I think, we finally come to Canada as the 21st ranked country of immigrants coming to the United States. So again, that reflects a much broader demographic transition. And do you think that under the conditions of economic insecurity and instability, looking around and seeing people that are increasingly different from you, or that don't look as much like yourself as they used to, do you think that that might have some effect on your thinking and perhaps even your sense of cultural identity? Again, I'm not talking about overt racism either. I think a relatively tiny percentage of the population are overtly racist as such. But what we do see in general is this inexorable global migration, and the majority of the world's population has always been non-white. And because of recent migration trends and the fertility rates, and again, among whites in particular, the U.S. is going to become increasingly more and more ethno-racially and linguistically diverse, for that matter. And of course, that can be a challenge then for people in terms of being able to adapt. So for example, I grew up in Northern Virginia, and our schools were predominantly white, at least where I went to school, W.T. Woodson High School. And the population in Northern Virginia, of course, has changed markedly over the last 4 decades since then. There's, in particular, I mean, there's a change everywhere, but there's especially a spike or a significant growth in the Hispanic population. And so without even looking up the numbers, how do I know this? Well, when I return back to Fairfax and Annandale, my stomping grounds, I come back once or twice a year to visit. It used to be my mother, who passed last year, but just family and friends in general. For example, I'll go into a Home Depot and I'll see bilingual signage on all the tools. That is, everything's posted in English and now in Spanish. Wouldn't have seen that decades ago. And of course, there are far more Mexican or Latino restaurants. There are more Spanish-speaking radio and news outlets, etc. So things have changed. Sure, there are a lot of people who are cool with that, no problem. And you've got people like me who years ago simply enjoyed Spanish class and learned to speak Spanish reasonably well. But that can also be perceived as a threat by some folks. And then that can be broadened to suggest that, hey, quote, immigrants are taking our jobs, end quote, right? Or even worse, illegal immigrants are taking our jobs. And illegal immigrants are committing crime and doing many other horrible things. So, and by the way, what do we know about immigrants in general, especially illegal immigrants? Well, they're overwhelmingly trying not to get into trouble with the law right? Especially since they don't have papers. Sure, as with any demographic population or group, you're going to have some people who are doing bad things and some really bad apples committing horrific acts of violence and that sort of thing. But my point is that the overwhelming majority of illegals, especially, are just trying to work. They're trying to pay their bills. They're trying to fit in as best they can and not stick out, right? Usually because they want to stick around. And yet you have a huge media machine and foreign influences, for that matter, that aim to tell a very different story. The hope then is to undermine the sense of trust and security and solidarity that people hope to be feeling. And that's quite easy to do if you can accentuate or even just outright lie about all of the undocumented illegals, for example, quote unquote, or to say nothing about the tendency amongst a certain segment of the right-wing extremists and racist to sort of paint people of color with the most negative of stereotypes. And even before it became in vogue to do so, I saw a lot of that stereotyping, even amongst some of my own family members and those people that I grew up around. But that stuff just accelerates when diverse populations come into contact with one another. And minority groups start numerically to be, posing something of a perceived threat to the majority groups, real or imagined. And guess what? Those committed to racial and gender rights and all forms of equal rights also end up fueling the fires to some degree, fueling the fires of the culture wars, at least with those on the extreme right. So whatever the merits, for example, of BLM or of DEI, these acronyms and the broader social movements that they represent struck a chord amongst those both on the left and on the extreme right. Most important, Trump and the right-wing extremists and the evangelicals, to a certain degree, were quite successful then in painting those who supported the ideas of BLM or DEI or trans rights, whatever, as left-wing radical extremists who just wanted open borders and they just wanted to fund the police and they just want to, change all of our kids into, change their sexes when they go to school, that sort of thing. So again, I don't actually know anybody personally who espouses those kinds of principles or supports all of those things. But again, that's not the issue. It's crucial to sell the message that Biden and then Harris and the Democrats are progressives and they're all radicals intent upon destroying the cultural fabric of the country. That's a powerful, powerful message, and it resonates deeply with a great many people. So again, my general point is that you see the world around you becoming more diverse in terms of peoples and ideas and their backgrounds and their languages and their religions. Or even if you don't see that personally in your community, you're being told that about the demographic shifts, everything that's occurring at a more global level. Right? And then there's usually negative implications or possible consequences to all that change, real or imagined. And it's then easy to start scapegoating either one specific group or whole categories of people, like illegal immigrants, quote unquote, or fill in the blank with whatever the preferred category of scapegoat might be. And then it's not difficult then to associate them or link them with your ongoing insecurities, not just in terms of the culture wars, but in terms of as the underlying cause of all your economic woes, as a threat to you and your kind in general. Okay, and then on top of that, we have to also consider the possible role of foreign entities like the KGB, who have been long interested in subverting the U.S. experiment in democracy, the republic as a whole. their main objectives by those who've defected, by all the evidence, is not just about security or intelligence on behalf of the Russian government, but it's much more about promoting ideological subversion and even conducting psychological warfare to subvert people's understandings of reality, to undermine the American or the Canadian experiment for that matter. But most directly, you have then, even beyond these foreign actors, the explosion of social media outlets that can and then do provide the fire hose of misinformation and disinformation to shape the narratives and stoke the fears. Does the left do that? Of course. And that was always the right's complaint, especially about mainstream or legacy media, which did and does even to this day. It's a much smaller aspect of the whole media ecosystem, but has typically or traditionally had more of a leftist or left-wing bias. So, but who really dominates the media today, and social media in particular? Well, there's no question. The evidence is clear and compelling. It's the right wing of the political spectrum, far and away. So now, if you're ideologically aligned then with the right, you'll no doubt view this as a good thing, right? Just as if you were ideologically aligned with the left years ago, decades ago, you'd be more supportive of legacy media. But here's what the latest research suggests. In 2024, there were 320 online shows, 191 that were right-leaning and 129 that were left-leaning. Again, that takes away those that purport or doing their best to maintain neutrality on all fronts. But when you could actually discern a political leaning, there were more right-wing than left-leaning shows covering news and politics and or had related guests. So these shows had upwards of, not quite, but almost 600 million total followers and subscribers in total. But here's the thing. The right-leaning online shows had at least 480 million total followers and subscribers, or about 5 times as many as the left-leaning shows, or almost 5 times as many. And across platforms, YouTube, Rumble, Twitch, Kick, Spotify, Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok, right-leaning online shows accounted for roughly 82% of the following of these on these 8 different platforms, the online shows. And again, the left-leaning ones only had about 100 million followers and subscribers. Okay? So again, we see a huge discrepancy then in terms of the actual numbers and the purported followers. So, and indeed, I want to also mention 9 out of the 10 of the online shows with the largest followings across the platforms were right-leaning, with a total following of more than 197 million. The only left-leaning show in the top 10 was the What Now with Trevor Noah, which had 21 million total followers and subscribers across platforms. So I could go on, but the evidence points to a very clear picture. So what's being promoted then across these different platforms? Things like caravans of immigrants, that rapists and murderers are flooding the borders and entering into the U.S. in droves, or that the crime waves are flourishing, fueled by illegal immigration and drug cartels, that trans people are taking over, that they can be found everywhere, but especially in women's sports. And if you send your child to school, there's a risk that he might be converted to a different sex. And under Biden and Harris, prisoners who are illegal immigrants can just go and have sex change operations. Haitian immigrants are eating the cats and the dogs, and so on. By the way, the ad suggesting that Kamala Harris supported taxpayer-funded sex change operations for prisoners and undocumented immigrants was an especially powerful and effective ad. The data only suggests that 2 inmates had actually sued the government to receive such surgery, and there's no evidence of migrants being approved of such care. But again, that's not the point. It's not about the facts. If you say, I don't agree with gender-affirming care, or I don't agree with sex change operations, just in principle, in general, then that alone would be possible justification to vote for Trump, right? If I said, I get it, but that's only happened twice, right? Well, you could say, well, that doesn't matter. How many more might happen or are going to happen under Harris and once the floodgates have opened? Right? Same thing with transgender athletes in collegiate sports. There are over 500,000 student athletes competing in NCAA championship sports. And then NCAA President Charlie Baker testified before a Senate committee in December that he's aware of only fewer than 10 such athletes who are transgender. And again, once the point would be the following. Well, I understand that there were at most 10 transgender athletes competing in collegiate sports, but that's still 10 too many, right, if that's your ideological position. And so I'll vote for Trump because he's promised to ban all such athletes from competing in collegiate sports. So that's how the justification process works. The other issue is related to statistics. Again, almost any politician can be accused, and probably rightfully so, of manipulating facts and statistics to favor their positions. But what's especially powerful these days is the extent to which statistical information can be generated that will never be fact-checked, that will never be cleared and verified. And since the right-wing echo machine dominates the social media landscapes, then their lies, their stats, will dominate too. If the left dominated the social media landscape, then their version and their lies would dominate. But instead, it's the opposite. The right-wing echo machine dominates the social media landscape, and they're able to construct the statistics and the narratives that favor much more powerfully Trump and right-wingers in general. Same thing in the case of abortion, or pick any culture war issue that you might be interested in. What's the bottom line? If you're feeling both economically and culturally insecure, then you're going to vote for the person who looks most like you and who promises to protect you against all such threats. And you're not likely going to have to worry about facts or evidence as such. And then you can weaponize, in fact, the information further through the factories, the bot factories, the troll farms that are out there, what have you. And thus, the right wing has been much more effective, in my view, to the point of, in terms of winning the culture wars. I'm not talking about ideologically or whether I agree with this position or that position. I'm talking about in the courts of public opinion and the extent to which they're able to attract partisans in support of their candidates, or at least in the case of 2024 election, in support of Trump. Now, of course, that all can change, depending on how things unfold on a number of different fronts. But let me just add to that, on top of what we've seen happening, who owns now X and Truth Social? These are the two dominant platforms, Musk and Trump. Again, it's not to say that it won't be a new one, and there is, there are alternatives, but Musk and Trump have dominated up to this point, or up to certainly through the election. And the other billionaire oligarchs, whatever you may think of them, people that own the legacy newspapers like Jeff Bezos, also owner of Amazon, of course, and then look at Facebook and Zuckerberg. So, who's control of these media outlets? Who's control of the messaging, by and large? And where do most people get their messaging? It's dominated by a right-wing echo machine, if you will. And as mentioned in Monday's statistical vlog, that's why you also saw then huge advantages amongst whites, for example, voting for Trump, and amongst men voting for Trump compared to vice versa. Trump has been extremely successful, and I would suggest most successful in terms of marketing himself as a cure to whatever economic and cultural toxins appear to be present, or at least that are communicated as being present. So even if the data don't support his claims, he's really good at just doubling down and repeating over and over again. And if they're lies, they're lies. That doesn't matter. And I'm not talking about the small stuff where you can quibble about the numbers or the metrics. I'm talking about even if the issue is genuinely black and white and the evidence is overwhelmingly black versus white. Even after the lie, even if it's a blatant lie, even if that's been exposed, Trump has an almost preternatural ability to stick to the lie and to his version of the truth, like Truth Social. Mine are the biggest crowds we've ever seen. We've had the greatest economy ever. I'm the healthiest president ever. No president has been treated as horribly as I have been. Crime was at the lowest under me. Under Biden and Harris, they're eating the cats and dogs, and so on. Right? So, again, there's no point in fact-checking because it's really just about the messaging, playing on the public's fears, and then claiming before the entire country, as he's now done on more than one occasion, quote, "I felt then and believe even more so now that my life was saved for a reason. I was saved by God to make America great again." End quote. Right? Well, that's a powerful message. And if you're having any doubts or insecurities, you can set those aside, right? Under what you're being told here. For many, then, it's just incredibly reassuring to know then that you too can be saved by belonging to this superior or privileged group, chosen by God, no less. And we all want to belong to a community, right? And MAGA is clearly an important community in the contemporary U.S. political landscape with a distinct identity. Just like wearing a cross identifies you as a Christian, or wearing a yarmulke identifies you as a Jew, or wearing a hijab identifies you as a Muslim, wearing a MAGA hat identifies you as part of a special, almost a quasi-religious community as well. Whether you're ultimately going to make America great again or not, or whether Trump's going to do that, or whether you're at least making a certain segment of the population believe that, there's no question that amongst the truly faithful, they feel better about themselves. Again, it doesn't matter what the objective reality or economic indicators might be and so on. Right? The point is that you're going to feel better yourself if you belong to that particular tribe, to that very specific community. And it is a strong and powerful community with their own symbols, with their own rituals and mechanisms of reinforcement. And as with any really powerful tribe or religion, you can be excommunicated. You can be cast out if you behave improperly or you don't believe in what you're supposed to believe. Okay? And again, it doesn't even matter whether the long term, the end game is to make America great again. What's important is that things will be great because our guy's in charge. And it's people like us now who are running the show. That's what's important. Okay? And again, it's just as important, certainly within the MAGA community, that you denigrate everyone not like yourself, that you establish the boundaries of your community accordingly. Okay? So the scapegoats then are anybody who's not part of your community, not part of your tribe. And such is the tribalist nature of the human condition. Again, don't believe me? Check out the much smaller online echo chamber on the left, who routinely trumpets the superiority of their own kind. right? Or in the case of Hillary Clinton, who described the base of the MAGA Trump supporters as a, quote, basket of deplorables. How did that work out? Well, it reinforced the tribal boundaries of her own group as such, but it did the same thing by reinforcing the perspective of the MAGA faithful. Right? And so while the world can feel like it's spinning out of control, we ourselves at times may feel like we've lost all control, especially if we look at our future economic prospects, to say nothing of the insecurity that some people feel about their own identities and their culture and their people, their kind. And so Trump effectively promised to take back control. And then many in the top media pundits and the mouthpieces and so forth on the right reassured people that daddy's home, that daddy's back. Right? Jesse Walter, Tucker Carlson, Pete Hegseth, Lauren Boebert, Byron Donald. And then you've got even celebrities like Mel Gibson and Kid Rock. All have used this language. And so in a world of globalization, of increasing AI dominance, technological transformation, an influx of new cultures and colors and languages, many folks feel like their worlds are spinning out of control. And they've been feeling that way for quite some time. And if they're seeing this economically too, and they're struggling paycheck to paycheck, having a strong man who looks a lot like you and promises to take care of you can seem like a great option. And it certainly did. So whether you agree with it or not, or like it or not, or think this or that will end beautifully or disastrously, that's not my point today. Rather, I've just tried to lay out and explain why Trump and Musk and MAGA-style Republicans have taken control of the U.S. government and the U.S. political economy, and they currently dominate the U.S. landscape. People have all kinds of personal reasons for liking this or that candidate, for voting for Trump or Harris, or maybe a third-party candidate. Yet, even if you didn't vote for Trump, I think it's important, to try to understand why did almost half of the voters cast their ballots and elect him as the 47th president of the United States. And if you understand better some of their main reasons why almost half of the voters, over 77 million, selected Trump, and why an almost equal number, but less, only 75 million, voted for Harris, then I think you can perhaps understand better and have a deeper and more meaningful set of conversations about what happened and where all of this may or may not be heading. Again, I'm not talking about what the consequences are going to be. I'm just suggesting it's important that we understand, well, why do people vote the way that they do? And what was it about Trump that so many people found appealing? Tens and tens upon millions. And then even more narrowly, though, you've got a core of MAGA faithful. And I've tried to explain, I think, why their messages are so appealing, or why so many people are attracted to the Trumpian vision of the United States and of the globe, for that matter. So there are a lot of forces at play, right? And we all have our influences and the factors and our backgrounds and the the evidence that points us in a certain direction. If you want to change that direction in a meaningful way, I think you have to start by understanding people and having conversations about why you and I or someone else feels the way that they do, thinks the way that they do, and has come to rationalize and offer the justifications that they do. Doesn't mean you can change my opinion that easily or I can do that towards you, but at least then I think we can have a better understanding and start to bridge our differences. Okay? All right. In the meantime, as ever, I wish for you and yours to continue to create peace in your lives and nurture love in your hearts, and give someone a hug today, regardless of their political perspective. See you soon.